we've been living through some interesting times. In the midst of all of those, one thing is evident. People still are in desperate need. People are still looking for the hope that there is in Jesus Christ. And our ministry is as relevant as it has ever been. And we need to try to make ourselves available. Tom had asked me if I would share with you something about a lesson I have been trying to learn in my own life because of COVID and the subsequent lockdown. So, in order to draw your attention to that and to focus on it for a few minutes, let me read to you a passage from the Old Testament, from the first book of Kings, chapter 17. It says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." Familiar, I'm sure, to all of us. And let me take a moment to tell you about my own challenge. In March of 2020, when the first lockdown was imminent, I heard various voices raised expressing grave concern about the possibility of financial hardship for not-for-profit organizations. I had met with one specialist group of auditors in a different context quite recently, and they had talked about a worst-case scenario of perhaps 20 or 25% of income being lost in the next few months from not-for-profit organizations. I began to think of what that would mean for us here in the United Kingdom, for the ministries we run, for the centres, the staff in the centres. And I was nervous. And I was aware of others in ministry who had almost seemed to be a little bit ahead of the game. They had already made videos, sent out to their donor base to say, "Please consider us in these difficult times, give us your best gift." And I wondered, should I be asking people for money right now? It was a personal issue for me. I have a responsibility as the director here in the United Kingdom, and others are looking to me. And my question was around whether or not I needed to be asking others to provide. However, the challenge for me was this. The challenge was, if I ask people to give, I will be able to ask in some circumstances where I get a little of whatever is out there. And I was conscious of the fact that in this unprecedented situation, I would use whatever I got to sustain what I believed was right. The challenge was this: was I willing to stand back, depend on God, and allow Him to show me what He was willing to sustain? And obviously, for most of us in Teen Challenge Ministries, we know what it is to start with nothing. That's how nearly all Teen Challenge Ministries I know began. They began with nothing. And when you have nothing, you have no alternative but to believe God. But as ministry grows and responsibilities to other people's lives grow with it, suddenly you're learning to depend on your own instinct, intuition, capacity to manage finance, to handle finance, to raise finance. I felt a very specific challenge to my own soul that in this pandemic that God was evidently aware of, I needed to be willing to see what was He willing to sustain of our ministry. Was I confident that the things we were doing were things that He thought were appropriate to sustain? And for several weeks, I wrestled with this account of Elijah that I read from 1 Kings 17. I must be honest with you, I never read it. I simply wrestled with what I knew of the story. And I've read it today simply to remind you of the detail. This was the challenge for me. In a lockdown, God looked after Elijah. Elijah was not free to go where he wanted and to do what he wanted in that season of his life. He was the one who had called on God to stop the rain. But God asked him to go into hiding in the Kerith ravine. We understand, if you read on into 1 Kings 18, by the time you get to verse 10, Obadiah tells Elijah at a later time that the king has sent servants to every nation and kingdom looking for him. This was a season when Elijah was being hunted, so he was necessarily shut up in one situation, not able to do anything, not prophesying to the nation, simply sitting day by day, waiting to see, will the ravens come and feed me? And he has to depend, moment by moment, day by day, on the birds that God sends with bread and meat. And they come in the morning, and they come again in the evening. But when they've been in the evening, Elijah has to trust they'll come again tomorrow. He doesn't have a store of food. He doesn't have a supply of food. He has to rely on God to send the ravens. And it's not the most reliable form of messenger to rely on. Now, as far as God is concerned, he had ordered the ravens to go. God believed he was utterly in charge of it. But from a human perspective, having to wait to see whether or not the birds will turn up today is a little bit of a challenge. But here's this other challenge. All of the time that Elijah is waiting to see whether or not the birds come, his life source, the brook, the water brook, is drying up. There's a drought. There has been no rain in the land. This is going to go on for a few years, according to the word of Elijah. We know from Jesus it took 3.5 years. And for 3.5 years, Elijah is in a lockdown. And for the first season of time, he's depending on birds to feed him. But after they have fed him, he's watching water drying up. Why did God allow the water to dry up? Why didn't God stop the water from drying up? But in the purpose of God, God allows the brook to dry up. And he speaks to Elijah, verse 9, "Go at once to the town of Zarephath in Sidon. I have commanded a widow there." There is for me, in my imagination, a sense of this must have been a great relief to Elijah. Brilliant. I'm not having to depend meal by meal on birds. I'm being moved on. I wonder what it's going to be like at this widow's home. I wonder what the store cupboards of her home will look like. I wonder what I'll get to eat there. And here's what amazes me about this account. Elijah, who has done God's bidding, is locked down as a result of it. He's hiding in fear for his life. And he's having to depend on God for every meal. And when the water source he is hidden by dries up, God moves him to a widow in Zarephath who has almost nothing. He doesn't move him to a widow who's wealthy. He doesn't move him to a widow who is flush and has extravagant supply. God, who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, God sends Elijah to a widow who has one final meal, a little flour and a little oil to make a meal for her and her son, and then she's resigned to dying. And for the rest of the 3.5 years, Elijah is put in a position where he has to wonder every day, when she takes her hand out of the barrel of flour, will there still be flour in it for tomorrow? When she pours out this last drop of oil, will there still be oil for tomorrow? And he's depending on God for every bit. And that was what I wrestled with. Because though Teen Challenge in the UK started with nothing, we've come to a place where we got some resources. And we've learned to have resources in advance of needing them. And my challenge was, in the economic pressures that are coming, in the lessening donated income that may come in, How will we manage? Was I willing to trust God? And this was personal, but it was, would I trust him, or would I go out and try to do the job for him? I would be much happier if I got money in the bank, if I got resources there. But I wrestled for several weeks thinking about, why did God make Elijah dependent on him for every meal? The ravens came morning, and he has to wait to see, will they come again this evening? He goes to a widow in Zarephath, and she has only sufficient flour in the barrel, sufficient oil for one meal. But every time she does one meal, there's still a meal left there. Do you ever get used to that? See, the truth is, I'm not sure that we ever get used to the fact that I have to depend on God again tomorrow. I would like to learn a lesson where I depended on God for a few weeks, and now that I've shown him I can depend on him, it's all really comfortable. And I wondered, God, you allowed this man who was doing your will to be locked down, and you didn't make it easy. Why should I think you would make it easy for me? My attention was drawn to two things particularly. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he said, "Give us today our daily bread." My experience in ministry has been, most people are not asking for daily bread in the countries I've lived in. Most people know where today's meal is coming from. They want to know about next week's. They want to know what's going to happen at the end of the month. Jesus, when he asked his disciples to pray, didn't say, project yourself into the future and wonder where your supply will be coming from in a week or in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks. He said, ask me for bread for today. It's a principle. I believe that the biggest lesson God has wanted me to learn, but not perhaps just me, but I believe the biggest lesson God has wanted me to learn in this lockdown, through this pandemic, is, can you depend on me? Day by day, moment by moment, will you trust me to provide? And I have to be prepared to allow some things that maybe I've sustained, that I have provided for, that God doesn't want to sustain any longer. Am I willing to let those go? Am I willing to trust that God will provide for the things that he wants to continue? And in our Teen Challenge ministry, I faced that particular challenge. Would I allow God to sustain what he was committed to? And would I let go of the things he wasn't willing to sustain? I want to be able to be depending on God for my daily bread. I want to trust him for today. And if he's asked me not to project myself into worrying about tomorrow, I think Jesus was quite specific about that, then I don't want to worry about tomorrow. But the other thing my attention was drawn to was this widow in Zarephath. When the ravens are no longer going to supply Elijah day by day because the brook has dried up, he moves him to a widow in Zarephath. Jesus says in Luke 4 and verse 25, when he's explaining to his own townspeople in Nazareth that a prophet is without honor in his own town. He said, were there not many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah? And his answer is yes, of course, there were many widows. But he says Elijah was not sent to any of these, but to a widow in Zarephath. The context of that is not everybody will love you. Not everybody will appreciate you. And we're going through a season of challenge. Not everybody will love what we're doing. Not everybody appreciates our ministry. Not everybody wants to help those who are in addiction. Not everybody wants to see hope offered in the way that Teen Challenge is offering it. Don't waste your time wondering about those who don't love you. God will command those he wants who will minister to you. God knew there was a widow in Zarephath who would have enough faith and enough commitment to the word of Elijah that she would risk everything on him. And the challenge for me was, did I believe God knew people out there who he could command to look after the ministry of Teen Challenge? People who might not have been known to us in any way. People who didn't necessarily have association with us. But is God able to find people and put us on their heart? And in the beginning of that lockdown in March, for several weeks I wrestled around this till I got peace. And when I got peace, I left the matter with God. I didn't look to try to raise finances. I didn't look to try to work out how I would sustain things. I rested in the fact that God is apparently committed to providing for what God wants done in the earth. It's been a great release to me. I trust that it might be an encouragement to some of you, because times are not easy. And the days we're living in are difficult. And everybody doesn't love us. And we don't necessarily know how we will keep going next week, next month, or next year. But apparently we don't have to work that out. We have to do what he wants us to do and what he's willing to sustain. And he will continue to sustain what he is committed to. God bless you all in the work and the ministry you're pursuing.